Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeff Levy, and I'm the managing partner at CAMAC Retirement Group, and we'd like to welcome you to our seminar or webinar entitled Fiduciary Best Practices at Public Universities. Our goal in this program is to help you understand some of the best practices to meet fiduciary responsibilities for a public university retirement program. We believe this is especially important today to protect your organization, maximize the benefits available to participants, and especially in light of the recent onslaught of lawsuits related to retirement programs. But before we begin, a couple of quick housekeeping notes. You can ask questions by entering them into the question box. Make sure that the pull down below that does say organizers and panelists. A copy of the deck can also be downloaded through the webinar, and the pull down again will say handouts and panelists. A recording of the webinar will be forwarded a couple of days following the session. Our speakers today include Eric Paley, who is a partner at Nixon Peabody. Eric is a team leader of the firm's employee benefits team and a member of the labor and employment practice group. He advises clients on how to comply with the laws governing their employee benefit programs. And he does spend a considerable amount of time working with clients on fiduciary compliance, which includes helping them establish or reconstitute their retirement plan committees, advising them on whether to engage a third-party investment consultant or conduct an RFP for a new record keeper, as well as educating boards, officers, and committee members on the rapidly changing legal landscape in which they operate. In addition, Joey Payne, who is a vice president and senior consultant at CAMAC Retirement Group, is joining the webinar. And Joey leads a team of consultants and account managers who serve the retirement needs of CAMAC Retirement Group's clients with a focus on public and private higher education institutions. He has more than 20 years in higher education, including 13 years as a chief benefits officer of a $4 billion defined contribution plan for a large research-intensive land-grant institution that has an academic medical center. And Joey has extensive experience with retirement programs and also has a bachelor's degree from University of Kentucky and a MBA from Eastern Kentucky University. And lastly, as I mentioned before, I'm the managing partner at CAMAC Retirement Group. I spent a lot of time on the development and implementation of strategic initiatives and account management for more than 30 years, and really all types of retirement programs. So again, our goal today is to educate everybody on some of the issues facing retirement programs, how to protect your organizations from a fiduciary breach. And that includes kind of what best practices will allow you, even as a public university, to protect yourself. So given that background, I'd like to turn it over to Eric Paley, who will take us through some of the legal implications of the issues we're discussing.
Well, thanks, Jeff, and welcome, everyone. I'm pleased to be here and sort of set the stage for the later part of the conversation and really give everybody a flavor of why this should matter to you. Hopefully, the very reason that you signed on to this webinar is because you have some sense of wanting to become compliant, if you will, from a fiduciary perspective. But I mean, I think really what my role here is to do is to paint sort of that picture and give you some context if you're not aware, perhaps blissfully unaware of what's going on outside the four walls of your office. I think I would liken this, without being too much of a scaremonger, to a tightening noose. What we have seen, and this is really where we're headed for my portion of the discussion, where we've come from over the last 10 plus years is a circumstance where prior to 2006, there was virtually little to any litigation around what someone's fiduciary responsibilities with regard to an investment menu and a retirement plan might be. And during the interim period from 2006 forward, we've really seen this franchise, if you will, this litigation franchise grow. It's a very lucrative franchise for the plaintiff's bar. And as a result, we've seen them kick down one wall after another, moving into yet another frontier. And as you'll see over the course of the next few minutes, where that franchise seems to be inevitably leading is toward public higher ed. Because of that, it's extremely important that you not only understand the context, but in the second part of this presentation, really what Joey's going to be talking about regarding the practices that you should all engage in to minimize the risk of liability. So with that, let me just paint that picture as to where we're headed. You see up with the slide on your screen, as I alluded to, this really all ushered in back in 2006, 2007, when a Midwestern law firm, the Schlichter-Bogart firm, which has now become somewhat infamous in this space, really ushered in this new class action litigation franchise. They saw this opportunity and simultaneously, or virtually simultaneously at that time, they sued 18 of the largest U.S. corporations. Why did they do that? It's really taken out of the playbook of class action litigation. They were looking for trying to identify the courts that would be the most sympathetic to their cause, and so strategically they spread out across the United States and targeted these large corporations really with the hopes of finding out where they could get the best legal precedents in their favor and ultimately perhaps exact some legal settlements, the thought being that once they had those favorable precedents and legal settlements, almost like, I hate to say it, gun in a bag litigation, they could go around and basically exact similar settlements or further precedent from other unwitting companies. And so, this has really been part of a broad strategy. So in 2006, 2007, as I say, they filed these lawsuits. And over the intervening years, we watched as those lawsuits percolated up through the federal court system. It was in 2012, while those cases were still percolating, that we saw the U.S. Department of Labor issue a series of regulations that required, at least in the private sector, the disclosure and much more transparency around the fees being charged by investment providers to retirement plans, because that's really what Schlichter's firm was attacking, was this notion that plan committees and fiduciaries associated with retirement plans were really being passive in their responsibilities. They had this fiduciary responsibility to act prudently on behalf of participants in the plans, but what they were allegedly allowing the investment providers to do was to charge excessive fees and offer imprudent investment options. And of course, the conclusion being drawn by Schlichter was that somehow the participants were being harmed as a result. So we see those lawsuits, we see the Department of Labor get involved, and then at least from the plaintiff's bar's perspective, we see the first of some, quote, important verdicts. These were verdicts in the Tussey case and the Tibble case where Schlichter was able to hold them up and say, look, we've got now some favorable court precedents that we can use as leverage to further, put our stake in the ground. They also succeeded in exacting some pretty hefty legal settlements to the tune of at least $200 million and counting. And so, again, a rather lucrative franchise for the firm. From there, we're still in the private sector. We move on to what we identified as sort of the second wave of litigation. And this is now the plaintiff's bar emboldened, seeing that, hey, there's blood in the water, let's go after this. We start to see more of these lawsuits being filed beginning in the middle of 2015. And over the ensuing year, we see upwards of 30 to 40 cases being filed. And we start to see the first copycat cases. The Schlichter firm has now laid out a blueprint for how to pursue these types of actions. And so other law firms are literally taking the filed complaints and going off and filing lawsuits of their own. So not only do we see a market uptick in class actions filed, we also see start to see, I should say, a number of additional varied and nuanced theories being brought to bear in these complaints. We also start to see these complaints and allegations come downstream. So the initial complaints were against very large corporations, with billions of dollars in their plans. Now we're starting to see at this time litigation being brought at plans as small as $10 million. So I'm moving to the next slide. Let me talk a little bit about what we're seeing in terms of these nuanced claims. You may notice a couple of these issues. The first being, and I'm having some trouble here, Jeff, so maybe you can help me by transferring to the next slide. The theories of attack being raised, you'll notice these are really agnostic as to whether we're talking about public higher ed or a private corporation. These are all issues that arise in the course of managing oversight of investments. For instance, the whole challenge between securing retail versus institutional share classes in a retirement plan was a big allegation of this new wave of litigation that came around in 2015. When are you entitled to institutional shares? How big do you have to be? What hoops do you have to jump through? Questions over the types of funds in the plan. Is a money market fund an appropriate fund to have in your menu of investments, or is stable value, which is relatively the same in terms of risk but delivers a higher potential return, is that a better action? And even if you have a stable value fund, you're somewhat damned if you do, damned if you don't. The plaintiff's bar went after the underlying investment strategy, at least in one case, where they alleged that although something on its face was a stable value fund, in fact, it was being invested much more like a money market. So, having to go into the internal investment theories behind particular funds suddenly became a target. Certainly a big one. Yes.
I'm sorry, Eric, if I could, one of the frustrations I think that a lot of the practitioners have in the retirement area, relates to these attacks being very generic, meaning that, copying one to the other and assuming that it applies in any suit that's brought. And I know you're going to talk about some specific differences in the 403B side, but was that a common practice throughout the class action suits in the past to simply, frankly, throw enough against the wall and see what sticks?
Yeah, I mean, so you're really going to the heart of how class action litigation exists. Now, granted, I'll reveal my bias, right? I work on the management side, the company, the government side of this. I'm not on the plaintiff side, so I have my clear bias on my sleeve. But the way class action litigation works, it truly is a machine. I mean, the idea is to go out fishing for clients. Literally, in some cases, we've seen over the last few years, as we'll get to it, people fishing on social media like Facebook for employees of a particular organization. The idea is to then literally cut and paste some of these complaints, perhaps fill in some obvious, specific factual allegations with regard to a particular organization, but really from a plaintiff's firm perspective, you want to minimize as much and manage your cost because you've got to be in there for the long haul. So you're trying to do as little work as possible in the early stages in the hopes that you're going to scare up enough, kick up enough dust and scare up enough potential plaintiffs that you can mount this challenge and get one or more of these, litigants to fall. So your point's exactly right, Jeff. There's a lot of cutting and pasting going on here, and you'll see from case to case a lot of similarities. It's not quite cut and paste, but it's pretty darn close. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And again, I think one of our concerns and one of the issues people are grappling with is the significant differences in especially the college and university marketplace, so to speak, because the programs are vastly different, which impacts the ability to get cheaper share classes, everything you're talking about on this page, record keeping fees, et cetera. So it is one of the frustrations we have being on the consulting side of the table. Yeah,
well, I can imagine. And I think, as we'll see in a few minutes when I get to kind of the slide where we go head on and talk about public higher ed, every industry, and I consider public higher ed its own industry, every industry believes it's different. There's something unique about us that immunizes us from these sorts of attacks. And the reality is, yes, there are some differences on the surface, but there's nothing here that's insurmountable. And as we'll see, at the core, the issues that are up there on the screen right now are precisely the same issues that will come under fire with public higher ed as they have with the private sector. So to your point, I mean, one of the big issues continuing down this list, record-keeping fees and investment advisory fees. Is it appropriate to provide for payment of those fees based on the percentage of assets in the plan as opposed to a fixed fee basis, particularly when you know that if the asset value goes up, the record-keeping cost, the cost that the investment provider has to expend to record-keep the plan really doesn't change all that much simply because of a change in a few participants here and there. And then you get into some of the esoterica, whether the disclosures being provided by the record keeper are really appropriate or are they too dense to be understood by particular participants, whether particular disclosures with respect to risk-based and target date funds really get to the heart of what the risks of those funds are. I know that Joey's going to talk about recapturing excess revenue. That's the name of the game. If you're paying your record keeper a certain amount, have you benchmarked what they're supposed to be paid, what they should earn for record keeping your plan, and no more? And what are you doing with that excess revenue? One that I see time and again, and I know you do, failure to conduct an RFP on a timely basis. It's amazing to me as I go around and speak to sophisticated organizations, clients, how many of them have failed to just put their plan out to bid on a regular basis every few years to ensure that they're getting the best bang for the buck for their participants. And then in some cases, some of the allegations that we saw in these second wave of litigation was plan sponsors going out and utilizing investment options that had very limited histories. So, keep in mind all of this because it becomes relevant as we talk. Moving to the next slide, we're talking now about the third wave of litigation, which really struck just a short while ago. It was the beginning of August 2016 when Schlichter, the infamous Schlichter that was responsible for ushering in this new franchise, finally broke into the nonprofit side. So they moved into the private sector nonprofit side and started going after higher ed head on. They went after a number of extremely large university retirement plans, and I suspect everybody on the call is somewhat aware, if not painfully aware of this. And this was the first time that they brought excess fee litigation to the higher ed community. The lawsuits are fashioned somewhat differently, but the underlying allegation is virtually the same as what we saw in the for-profit side. And they're alleging that these universities breached their fiduciary duties by failing to properly oversee and manage their retirement savings plans. You see up on the screen the alleged breaches of fiduciary duties. I'm not going to walk through them explicitly because, quite frankly, they read as much like the allegations I just walked you through with regard to for-profits. And that's sort of the issue, Jeff, that you pointed to, which is it kind of doesn't matter. You can get through the little hurdles, if you will, about, well, this is a different industry. But once you get over that hurdle, you're talking about the same issues because they're dealing with investments, they're dealing with record-keeping fees, they're dealing with plan management fees, all the same things we saw in the for-profit world. Now, there was something of a hurdle proposed. Well, higher ed and the 403B plan market is different, and Schlichter and the rest of the law firms don't understand that. In particular, they don't appreciate, it was alleged, that 403B plans really grew up in a different way than 401k plans did in the for-profit world. In particular, as many of you know, the 403B plan market has a lot of legacy products available that have existed, particularly individual annuities, and as a result, it's never been as easy as in the for-profit world to simply map investment assets from these individual annuity products over to a group annuity product. In fact, you can't. You need individual participant permissions, and so that was described as one limitation that made this different, and why Schlichter and others didn't appreciate and understand what they were getting into. Likewise, there are differences in the record-keeping platforms. It's not easy for, say, the Fidelities of the world to record keep what TIA or Mutual of America might have in their investment lineup, and as a result, it wasn't as easy for the plan sponsors to move people over. And finally, and this everybody I'm sure on the phone can appreciate, higher ed, whether we're talking the private higher eds or public higher eds, there's sort of a unique historical engagement by the faculty. It's cultural. I mean, I've seen it time and again with university plans and their committees. You tend to get a lot of engagement by the faculty and the staff and the plan offerings. There's almost a strong allegiance for certain providers, and that, again, really makes the dynamic much different in the higher ed space, whether you're talking private or public higher ed. So we've now come to where the noose tightens, and this is sort of my last slide, and we can move on to talk about practices, but I put up here with the question mark, but I don't think it's much of a question. We have been moving in this direction for the last 12 years. Public university retirement plans are well within the sweet spot and the target of the plaintiff's bar. Yes, there are some differences, and we will acknowledge. In the private sector, you're dealing with ERISA. It's a single body of law that covers everything. And you're also dealing with certain unique issues in the public entity sphere that you don't deal with. For instance, the concept of sovereign immunity. When can I sue public officials, public committees? The law is very specific about that. However, and it's a strong however, virtually everything else that we're talking about here applies to higher eds. And let me just run down this list. The state level standards of fiduciary responsibility will apply. So we don't have ERISA, but in each of the 50 states, it's absolutely clear that there are fiduciary standards governing those, the committees and others who are responsible for overseeing retirement plans. They are expressed in the statutes, and the basis for those fiduciary responsibilities derive much like fiduciary responsibility under ERISA. So these are cousins. We get it. We're very familiar with those laws. And in fact, though there has not as of yet been a litigation filed against a public university for a breach of fiduciary responsibility overseeing a menu of investment options, we have certainly seen fiduciary responsibility breach cases brought before. We've seen them in a lot of different states, and they go after these particular standards that I've described. And so you can imagine that plaintiff's bar would be licking its chops, looking at a multi-billion-dollar plan and saying, what hurdle do I have to get over here? And that's sort of the next point. The hurdles here aren't that insurmountable. There have been cases brought, and so we know how to do it, or I should say they know how to do it, and it's a matter of time before somebody dips their toe in the water and says, I can just as easily go after this public university as I can go after a private. Continuing on, the alleged fiduciary breaches that they will bring look and smell exactly like the alleged fiduciary breaches we've seen in the private sector. They'll be fashioned in much the same way. They'll make allegations that committees and others charged with oversight of the plan have been asleep at the switch to one extent or another, that they are offering fee-laden, expensive investments to participants, and that they haven't appropriately kicked the tires, and as a result, participants have been harmed. And the reality is, I don't care if we're talking about a committee in the government sector for a public higher ed plan or in the private sector. Committees are committees are committees. There needs to be an infrastructure in place, and I know Joey's going to talk about this, but there needs to be an infrastructure in place that allows the plan fiduciaries to exercise their responsibility of prudence. And the best way to do that, and it's typically dictated in the laws of each state, is that there is a mandated committee overseeing the plan. How is that committee comporting itself? What is it doing to ensure that it's satisfying this fiduciary responsibility to minimize its risk of litigation. And finally, I'd point out that, as it should be apparent by now, we're agnostic as to who the plan sponsor is. Again, you can get over these state hurdles, if you will, about sovereign immunity and the others. Once you've gotten past those hurdles, whether the plan sponsor is one of the largest publicly traded corporations in America or one of the largest public higher ed retirement plans in America, it doesn't much matter. We're now talking strictly about how they exercise prudence, how the committees exercise prudence, and that's why I would think within the next short while we're going to start seeing, a wave of these retirement plan lawsuits happening. So with that, Jeff, unless you have any questions, I'd like to hand the baton over to Joey to talk about what it is that everybody can do to sort of minimize their risk so that they don't end up splayed across the front page. Joey?
Sure. Thanks, Eric. Let me see if we can advance the slides forward.
Yeah, I think we were having some trouble for everyone's edification, so I think I'm going to try and advance the slides from this point forward so we don't have any trouble with it. So go ahead, Joey.
Sounds great. Okay, so when we talk about establishing a fiduciary process, the first place to start is establishing a committee. The committees typically are established by the Board of Regents or Board of Trustees through administrative regulations. When you start to look at who will comprise the committee, you're looking for people with experience in finance, people from the finance or budget side of the house, also looking for people in human resources, and also considering stakeholder groups. Faculty members are important to have, especially if there's a college of business. If you can get a faculty member in the area of finance to participate, that certainly goes a long way. When we talk about committee functions, selecting and monitoring the investments in the plan, that's a huge role. A lot of the administrative functions will be delegated to HR. And then finally, the committee will be utilizing experts to help them carry out their functions, hiring outside counsel, hiring consultants, investment advisors, et cetera.
So, Joey, related to that, I'm just curious. I know we've had some questions over the past couple of years about, who even in a public setting might be the fiduciary, and can you really transfer that responsibility? So I think people would be interested in hearing your experience and whether that is possible as they're considering delegating some of these responsibilities.
Sure. When we look at who the committee reports to, sometimes in larger committees, there's a VP of finance that maybe, has signature authority for all contracts. So that responsibility might tend to fall on that person. In some of the smaller institutions, I see committees reporting up to the president. So, by having a committee, you're kind of taking that responsibility off of that person and, having a process to vet these decisions versus having everything roll up to those individuals.
Okay, great.
Next slide.
Yeah, again, we're having a little bit of delay, but go ahead.
Thank you. So when we talk about due diligence, typically this is done on a quarterly basis. On the left-hand side, the key things here is we're looking at fund performance. We're looking, comparing against benchmarks, looking at any funds that should be placed on watch or replaced, and write-ups around why that should happen. On the right-hand side, looking at governance, the committee charter. This is going to indicate who's on the committee, how decisions are made. Investment policy statement. This is a key document. It's going to look at what asset classes are going to be covered, types of investments, mutual funds, annuities, et cetera. And then what kind of metrics are going to be used to evaluate the funds. And then finally, education process. We're looking at, evaluating participation in the plan, looking at evaluating retirement readiness, for each individual that's in the plan. Next slide. Okay, the next slide is, I think, is really important because, Eric talked about fees, and, I think it's intuitive that you would say you would rather pay, less in fees than more. But I think this slide really drives home, the need to have low fees in your plan. This is from a research paper that looked at employees starting out at age 25 through their career at age 67. The starting salary was $30,000 for one worker, $75,000 for another. So in higher education, I think we could easily say this is a staff person on the left, and this is a new faculty person or maybe an administrator on the right. And so if somebody is paying 1.3% or 130 basis points in fees over their career, that's $166,000 for the $30,000 worker and $409,000 for the higher income worker. But if we can reduce those fees, look at the savings. If we can get the fees down to 100 basis points or even down to 25 basis points, this is significant savings, and this is what these lawsuits are all about. Next slide. So when we talk about investments in share classes, at the bottom of the page, here's an example. As a fiduciary is on the plan, you're charged with, putting in the appropriate share class, and the idea is to get the lowest cost. So if we look at the second column, this is the net expense ratio. This is what participants are going to pay. In the first line there, you see institutional share class at 95 basis points or 0.95%. And then below, there's an investor share class at 1.19% or 119 basis points. Now, the key thing is the next column on the right is called revenue sharing. And this is an amount of money that's allocated as a part of that investment fee to pay for record keeping. Our slides are going crazy. There we go. So at the end of the day, if you work your way across, since there's no revenue sharing on the institutional share class, the net investment fee is 95 basis points. However, since there's 40 basis points of sharing on the investor class, in this particular case, the lowest net investment fee is with the investor class fund. Now, so you have to actually look at each fund that's in your investment array and make sure that you're getting the lowest net cost. Next slide.
And part of the, Joey, before we go to the next slide, part of the frustration, I think, with some of these lawsuits today is it just assumes that the lowest possible expense for a particular fund is the most appropriate fund to offer to participants. Without recognizing this revenue sharing. And again, the revenue sharing can be provided back to the participant or used to pay expenses, but frequently people just assume that the lowest cost or the lowest net expense ratio fund is the one that's most appropriate for participants. So,
and the other problem with that is when you set the menu, is these investment share classes change throughout the year. So you have to monitor this constantly so that you have, the lowest net cost, at all times.
Sure.
So when we talk about administrative fees and record-keeping fees, what you see on the slide here are some of the items that actually impact what the record keeper is going to charge you to administer your plan. The complexity of the plan is certainly something that comes into mind. How often you want them to visit your campus, your geographic location. If you're in the middle of a large city, it's likely that firm has an office there versus if you're in a rural location. And then to the extent that you're willing to share data, record keepers like to have data. It makes their jobs easier. If they can get, for example, on the back end, termination dates on a regular basis, then that can help them process paperwork without having to call the plan sponsor, seeking information. And then on the front end, if they can get information such as salary, name, date of birth, they can actually, for all the eligible employees, they can actually set up accounts for people as they enroll or partially enroll, and that makes their job easier. Plus, when people call in, they can put some context around the conversation. And a lot of times, the record keepers will see if people are willing to share data that they'll actually lower their costs for required revenue. Then finally, as far as looking at fees, fees should be looked at annually, and I think, as Eric mentioned earlier, you need to do an RFP, every 3 to 5 years. If that vendor knows that the business is out to bid and there's a chance they may lose it, they're going to have a sharper pencil when they put the proposal together.
I think, again, one of the frustrations with some of these lawsuits is the generic nature of comparing fees. So as you can tell from this slide, there's a lot of factors that will impact the amount of fees being charged by the record keeper, the ability to change share classes, et cetera. And especially when it comes to, there's a commonly quoted number, what is it, Joey, $45 per head as what it should cost for administration, which does not take into account any of these factors, which impacts it greatly. So that's, and I know you experienced that in your prior life at a large university in terms of the factors that impact the ongoing cost.
Sure. Okay, the next slide, this is just kind of an overview of the process that you should take when you're looking at fees. You're going to look at what services that are being offered in the plan, what the appropriate fees will be and negotiated, and then how are you going to charge those fees? Are you going to do it on a percentage basis or a fixed dollar basis? You're going to add in, additional expenses for legal, audit, investment and consulting services. And then finally, how are the participants going to see this? Are they going to see this through the traditional approach where everything's kind of baked in, or is it going to be a transparent approach? So the next few slides, we're going to talk about these items. So next slide, please.
Again, it's unfortunate delays, so bear with us if you could.
I think we jumped way too far ahead. Okay, yeah, it's in that, there we go. So traditionally, the record keeping fees are paid as a percentage or basis points. Looking at the revenue share that is available within the investments. And typically the investments that have revenue share are annuities, and actively managed funds. Sometimes index funds, especially like target date index funds or index funds in general, since the idea is to have a lower record keeping costs, a lot of times there is no revenue share with those funds. So what happens is the people that have the funds that have revenue share are paying all the fees. And so that's kind of been cited in some of the lawsuits. And, so the next option is looking at a per head fee, as Jeff said earlier. And the per head fee is kind of the 401k model. And I think it's easy for, everybody to understand if we say you're going to be charged $20 a quarter, and everybody pays that. The problem is it's a regressive fee. The people that have smaller account balances are actually paying a larger percentage for administration. And also, too, when you convert to a fixed fee with the record keeper, the record keepers, their fees continue to go up as the market goes up. And over time, they're getting a much greater increase than what you might call an inflationary increase. So when you convert initially to a fixed fee with the record keeper, that price is going to be a little bit higher than maybe what you paid previously, because they're going to bake in some kind of inflationary increase, whether it's 2%, 3%, CPI, whatever you negotiate with them. And then finally, the hybrid approach is where you're actually negotiating a fixed amount with the record keeper, but you continue to charge your participants a percentage, and then you reconcile that in your revenue credit account.
Joey, in your experience, Joey, are the record keepers in a position to properly support all these forms, and aren't they developing some new approaches as far as hybrids, et cetera?
Yes, I think that, a lot of times we see questions in RFPs, what can you do? What can we do to cap how much we're paying in record keeping fees? And, so I think that's one of the things that the record keepers are doing is realizing assets are going up much quicker than general inflation. And we are seeing, the required revenue go down significantly each year as far as what the vendors are charging, and they're putting in different ways of capping that, looking at how much, if the fees go up by a certain amount, then the cap applies. If the fees don't go up by that amount, then it's actual, what the calculated amount is. So there's different variations of that. Now, where a lot of plans are moving to is what's called levelized fees. So I presented the issue previously that the problem with the percentage approach is that with the revenue share, some people are paying fees and some people aren't. And so what this is designed to do is to get everybody to pay the same percentage for each investment. So if you'll move to the next slide, please. The next slide actually illustrates that. On the left-hand side, you'll see you have 4 funds. There's a real estate fund, an equity fund, a fixed income fund, and an S&P 500 index fund. So the second column, this is built-in revenue share that each of those investments have. And you can see 24 basis points for the real estate fund. Now, up at the top, we've negotiated with the record keeper that it's going to be 12 basis points. That's what they need to administer the plan. And then we've actually calculated under for the additional plan expenses, the audit, legal, investment, consulting, another 2 basis points is what we need. So that's a total of 14 basis points. Excuse me. So going back to the real estate fund, there's 24 basis points that are being held there for revenue share for record keeping. We're going to apply 14 basis points to that, and then that's a net of 10 basis points that's going to get credited back to each participant's account that has that fund. And if you go down through the list there, you'll see credits back for the first 3 funds. When we get to the final fund, the S&P 500 index fund, you're going to see that there is no revenue sharing. So right now, before we levelize fees, they're not paying anything for record keeping in that fund. But under levelized fees, they're going to actually be charged on a quarterly basis, in this case, 14 basis points, and they'll see that charge on their quarterly statement. Now, this is a fundamental change in how things are being done because, initially, all the fees are baked in the net asset value for each investment, and participants aren't seeing fees unless they have a fee for a loan or maybe a qualified domestic relations order, something like that, or early redemption fee. But going from an implicit fee to an explicit fee is what's happening here when you do fee levelization and you start charging participants quarterly.
And you get into some subtleties, Joey, if I'm not mistaken, with not only is it something new that participants haven't seen before, but to your earlier point, some people have been paying larger amounts that may now be paying the same fee but have very small account balances. So that's one of the issues the record keepers are grappling with in order to make sure that people feel levelizing fees is fair for both large accounts and smaller accounts.
Exactly. So here's a case study. This particular plan had multiple record keepers. They had no fiduciary committee. They weren't achieving any economies of scale. Participants were confused over the number of investment choices that they had. Annuity contracts were being used by 3 of the 4 record keepers. Typically proprietary funds being offered. And certainly no fee levelization at that point. So after this plan established a fiduciary process, They were able to develop and implement an investment policy statement, a committee charter. They developed a loan policy. They were able to actually reduce the record-keeping fees. They negotiated required revenue with the 4 vendors that they had and asked each vendor, if you're one of the 2 remaining vendors, what will the fees be? And one of the things they were able to do, they eliminated the high-cost annuity platforms. One of the previously high-cost annuity providers switched to a mutual fund platform and was able to get the pricing down to a reasonable level. And that was really because we asked, so prior to that negotiation, if things would have just kind of hummed along over the years, they would continue to offer that annuity platform. And under some of these high-cost annuity platforms, you're seeing participant fees, in the 150 to 200 basis points levels. Non-proprietary mutual funds were added to the lineup, so now you have a best-in-class array. We negotiated required revenue, so we established a revenue credit account to capture that required revenue, to pay out the fees, and anything that's left over actually goes back to the participants. And then the 2 companies that weren't chosen going forward, those investments were frozen. A lot of these old contracts are individual contracts with participants, so you can't just map the assets to the new vendors. But participants can keep their money with the old vendor and just use a new vendor going forward, or they can make an individual decision to actually transfer money to one of the new vendors going forward. And then finally, looking at rebranding the retirement plan, with 4 vendors, a lot of employees, do you have like the state DD plan, or do you have the ORP? If so, who do you have? And they'll mention a participant's name, a vendor's name. There's really not a lot of, institutional branding oftentimes, at that level. But when you get the number of vendors down to, 1 or 2, and you're actually negotiating and working with them, you have a committee, you can put your brand out there. People see you're managing the investments. And I think that it's a value add for the institution because, a lot of people understand what's happening, in this space and with the lawsuits and fees and things like that. And they see their employer managing that, and I think it adds value. And then finally, this group did, when they started looking at fees, they said, yeah, we do need everybody paying the same amount. But that's a whole nother discussion when you start talking about flat fee versus, a percentage, and it does take time, because there's a huge educational process that has to happen when you move to fee levelization. So
Sure.
I think that's the last slide that I have, Jeff.
Sure. Well, yeah, thank you, Joey. We do have a number of questions, and I think there's several related to multiple plan providers. So I'll start with you, Joey. The question is, we currently have 3 retirement plan providers. How do we get to 1 without making everybody upset?
Well, I think what you have to do is you have to go through a process. You have to figure out, what investments are available right now. What are the costs of those investments? What are the fees being charged now? And then, typically going through an RFP process, you may want to do a full-blown RFP where you invite outside competition, or maybe you are looking to keep it within the 3 vendors that you have. But I think a lot of times when the committee sees, the cost involved and then what can be achieved by going to 2 or to 1 vendors, it's pretty easy from that standpoint. And then, you take that information and you distill it down to the appropriate sound bites and level for the employees and plan participants. And you're like, what we found is we could actually save you guys money if we reduce the number of vendors. It's economies of scale. And I think most people understand that, and, at the end of the day, because of the individual contracts, they can freeze the monies that they have with the current provider. They only have to participate with a new provider going forward. And I think a lot of times when people understand when they separate, if they're in love with that original provider, they can transfer money back to that account. And I think most people are okay with that.
Let me, Jeff, if I could, let me just add something to that real quick. The question's a good one, but it's almost not the right question. Certainly the political issues around reducing the number of record keepers are fraught with a lot of angst. But the nature of fiduciary responsibility is such that it's a paternalistic undertaking. The role of the committee when they're reviewing the menu of investments and the number of record keepers is to look out for the best interest of the plan participants, and that typically means reducing down to a single record keeper for economy of scale purposes. So yes, there could be political issues you're going to have to deal with, but at the end of the day, and Joey did a good job just emphasizing this, you're aiming for a better experience for the participants, lower costs. They're going to put everybody in a better position. Not everybody's going to be 100% happy, but to be mindful of your legal responsibility to get you where you're supposed to go is really sort of what you should be focused on in the big picture.
Sure. All right, great. Another question which I've heard from some clients in the past. So if we have a fiduciary committee, should we carry additional insurance? So, Eric, I'll let you take that one.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because, of course, in the private sector, when you deal with that question, the answer is, well, who's going to pay for this lawsuit if we get sued? And the answer typically is, well, it's going to be the company. And if I'm on the committee, I want to make sure that, A, the company has adequate assets to protect me, and if they don't, I want to make sure that there's insurance in place to protect me. You're going to engage in the same exercise as a committee member for a public sector higher ed plan. You want to understand the extent to which the state coffers or whatever public coffers are lined up behind you, and for what reasons. If the state is going to stand behind you or someone will stand behind you, you feel pretty good, you feel protected. That's a good thing to know, but until you go through that exercise and understand what's there, I'd be a little reluctant to move forward with my committee responsibilities. So I think that's an important exercise every committee should go through and understand what pots of money are available and under what circumstances. If I, for instance, just as a quick for instance, I know that in the state of Wyoming, of all things, that it's very difficult to sue somebody serving on the committee for a breach of fiduciary duty unless they basically, go off and kill somebody. I mean, it's a pretty high standard. So I might feel pretty good there, that I can do no wrong. But that's absolutely not the case in other states, and so that's why it's so important to go through that exercise.
So, Eric, you're implying there are a lot of differences per state. Is that something that's been tested at all in any way that you can think of?
I'm not sure where you're headed, but we don't, unfortunately, we just don't have a great body of law that we can look to. You're absolutely right. I mentioned earlier, we've seen suits brought on the DB plan side, breaches of fiduciary duty, but I'm not sure they've delved greatly into the scope of protections available from insurance or otherwise. It's really been around what types of actions constitute breaches of fiduciary duty. So somewhat uncharted territories, but all the more reason that, you really owe it to yourself to go through the exercise of determining what coverage you have and who's going to protect you if something goes wrong.
Sure. Joey, you were going to say something?
Yeah, one of the things as I've seen new committees being put together, committee members start asking questions about liability, and oftentimes, they go to the risk management department and look at what kind of insurance is in place, in the current situation, and I've seen groups go out and buy additional fiduciary policies because they felt like that the committee was operating outside of the scope of where the current coverage is extended. And then I've seen other groups say, risk management comes back, they've talked to their carrier, they feel like that the coverage is there, but maybe they increase the limits because of the size of the plan. So I do think it's a good idea, to have some kind of insurance in place, because as a fiduciary on the committee, that's going to make you more comfortable and helping make the decisions.
And not to beat this horse anymore, but I will. Fiduciary liability in the first instance is always personal. So somebody serving on a committee of one of these institutions in the first instance technically has personal liability. How do you protect against that? Well, first place you might look is to state law and see if the doctrine of sovereign immunity prevents you from being sued, like I mentioned in Wyoming or in a different state. But Joey's absolutely right. Once you get past that, you've got to understand where that money's going to come from. And if there's room for insurance or a need for insurance, you should make sure that it's purchased.
Sure. Joey, there's a question that came up on fee levelization. Are there any public universities that you've heard of using fee levelization at this point?
Yes, there are. I think that, what I've seen is, a lot of this has to do with how long your committee's been in place, because I think the more committees learn and are exposed to fees, you get into this discussion about everybody should be paying the same amount. Not so many people are going to flat fees out of the gate, but do see a lot of fee levelization. A number of the large public universities recently have moved in that direction.
Okay, great. When you have the premise of multiple providers and the voluntary programs versus others, are there differences, Joey, from your perspective in terms of responsibilities when you have multiple voluntary offerings versus a program that's part of the core state offering?
Well, I think it kind of goes back to at a high level, there's two questions. Why are you establishing your committee? Are you doing it for compliance, or are you doing it for the benefit of the participants? Hopefully both. But if there's no employer money in the plan, some people might take the approach, well, we don't have a responsibility there. But I think if you go back to the slide that I had looking at retirement plan fees, I think that there is a responsibility to offer your employees the lowest cost options that are available. Employees enroll in benefits because they think they have been vetted, by the employer, and that, they're doing the right thing. But, if they later find out that, maybe they've been paying too much over time, whether you can win a lawsuit or not, that's one thing, but you're certainly not going to win in the court of public opinion. So I think there's a lot of negative press that can come out, the fact that you allow these multiple plans to exist. Some of these people are paying 200 basis points for investments while the institution down the road is managing those investments and people are paying 50 basis points.
Right. To be clear, Joey, something you said, they have an obligation to provide the lowest cost. You mean strictly within the same asset, that's the lowest share class like you described. You're not saying that within a particular type of investment, say a particular investment class, you have to choose the lowest cost regardless of how good or bad it is, right? I just want to make sure that that's clear.
No, yeah, you're exactly right. You're looking at within an investment. And, you also have to look at, how that fits within the plan and what kind of structure that you have for paying fees. It's all about a process. Having a process where you're documenting issues, documenting decisions, and that's what you can revert back to if anybody questions why are you doing things. But without a committee and without actually managing these investments, you don't really have anything to fall back on.
Sure. There is, Eric, a question here that's kind of interesting. I do understand that how fiduciaries are, quote unquote, determined, but somebody is asking if you really only have one provider, and they make all the decisions. So you've kind of turned the keys to the kingdom over to that one entity. Are they really the fiduciary, is the question that was posed.
Yeah, well, that's a loaded question. The devil's in the details, right? So I'd like to really know, and the source for this initially will be the service agreement with that outside provider. I'd like to really know if they're truly responsible for calling all the shots. If I, as a member of the committee or the committee itself, has no ability to veto, under the service agreement, decisions being made by the provider, then there's an argument to be made there that perhaps that provider has some fiduciary responsibility. But I will tell you, and I think you know where I'm going, the investment providers have built quite a strong history of exculpating themselves from any sort of fiduciary liability, because they say we are just the provider and our expectation is that you, plan sponsor or committee, will be making those decisions. So I'm highly suspicious that they're calling the shots. They may well be leading you around and directing you where to go. But I also might add, too, that no committee can ever exculpate itself 100% from fiduciary liability. The mere fact that they have gone out and hired a provider is in itself an act of fiduciary responsibility. And so there is an ongoing responsibility to oversee what's being done that provider, even if they're calling all the shots, as the questioner puts it. So it's worth a deeper investigation. You'd want to look at the service agreement in the first instance.
Makes sense. And there's another question related to the issue we talked about before. So there's one retirement plan provider for this organization's main retirement plan, and that's offered through the state. However, they have 4 TDAs, and the providers that were selected locally, so to speak, for the voluntary 403B and 457B. And the question is that something that they need to manage? So I know it's also probably a loaded question, Eric, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and hearing Joey talk, I mean, I think we'd probably agree on this. I know we'd agree on this. The fact that it's all one institution, arguably overseen by a single committee, even if there are local decisions being made in separate providers, it all goes back to your process and how prudent it is. And part of that prudent process is taking a look at the totality of your circumstances and deciding, are our participants best served by having one provider over here and 4 separate providers on the other side? I suspect, Joey, you're going to say that, from a cost perspective, it's very likely that that's going to be an expensive proposition and perhaps not in the best interest of the participants.
That's exactly right. And if you're talking about a large university, there could be hundreds of millions of dollars in these supplemental accounts. If you're talking about a small university or college, it may be that there's maybe $5 to $10 million in these supplemental accounts. And so when you're spreading that across 4 vendors, you're just absolutely not getting any economies of scale. And so to the extent that you can give that business to one vendor, and going back, prior to the mid-2000s, one of the reasons that plan sponsors had multiple retirement plans is they wanted to offer their employees some choice and diversity around the investment menu. And prior to the mid-2000s, what that meant is you had to go out and sign a contract with, a number of different companies to be able to get their investments on the menu. But, since the mid-2000s, this concept of open architecture, which means that each of these record keepers can provide investments from other fund managers on their platform. You know, I mean, virtually any of them. I know Fidelity and TIA don't play together very well in the sandbox, but other than those two, they can all record keep each other's funds. So there's really no need to have multiple record keepers, you know, on a plan. You know, what it really comes back to is the tools, the on-site service, and some of the things that they offer, the plan sponsors. You know, those are going to be the decision points around, you know, why that you're going to hire, you know, a particular record keeper. But the actual investments, if you're using an advisor, an ERISA 321 advisor, then they're going to be a co-fiduciary on the plan. They're going to be able to pick an investment menu, you know, working with the committee and the investment policy statement that's going to be best in class and, you know, give the employees, you know, a nice array of funds to choose from. And they'll monitor those funds so that they make sure that they get the optimal performance that they should get over time.
And I would clarify there, since we slipped into our ERISA hats, what we're talking to when we say an ERISA 321 advisor. For folks on the phone, what we really are talking about is an advisor that is taking on fiduciary responsibility with you, holding your hand, if you will, and being you know, liable for those decisions. The fact that it's fashioned as an ERISA advisor doesn't necessarily compute in the public sector, but that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, and that's just a name. That's a name that's commonly bounced around. You know, if you go back to the very first slide that I had when we talked about a committee, and we talked about the responsibilities of the committee, and one of the things we talked about was selecting and monitoring the investments in the plan. You know, and there may be one or two knowledgeable individuals on a college campus, you know, that could, you know, do that exercise. If you have a, you know, finance faculty, they probably could do that too, but they wouldn't want to accept the liability of making those decisions. So that's why you outsource those decisions, or go and get, not totally outsourced, but you go out and get expert help to make recommendations to the committee so that you can actually make those decisions.
And I know there's a lot of implications of, you know, turning the reins over to somebody else. I think one of the things that people have misunderstood over the years is having too much choice, too many options, letting people decide on their own. So it's a fine balance between offering a more refined approach to everything, whether it's a number of funds, number of record keepers, et cetera. Most of that turns into a difference in the amount of fees that you pay if you have a lot of choice. And that's where a lot of these lawsuits have gone as well. If you consolidate like funds, for example, S&P 500s or whatever it happens to be, you're likely getting a lower cost. Similarly, if you consolidate record keepers, ultimately you're likely getting a lower cost because of the law of large numbers, so to speak. And that's possible in certain states, not possible in all states, because there is the premise behind a minimum that might be required. There are some states that have minimums of 2, 3, 4, et cetera, in terms of the number of record keepers or platforms that are offered on it. And Joanne, I know you've gone through that both on the TDA side as well as on the main retirement program.
Yeah, and even though there's rules in place around, you know, you have to have, you know, a set number of record keepers, it doesn't mean you can't manage the plan. You know, all the things that we talk about as far as building the investment array, negotiating required revenue with the vendors, you know, looking at how participant fees are being charged. These are all fiduciary responsibilities that exist regardless of how many vendors that you have. You know, certainly, you know, if you're in a ORP situation where the state regulations, you know, dictate how many providers you have, then, you know, I guess they're going to have to sue the state, you know, if somebody has an issue with that. But but outside of that, all the other issues that we've been talking about are still the responsibility of the local institution, and they need to have a process, you know, for managing that.
I think one of the other issues that we've gotten a lot of questions about as the whole litigious nature of the industry has come up in the last couple of years is, well, is there a way that, and some of the questions even went along these lines, is there a way that you can make everyone happy while at the same time protecting yourself? So it really comes down to, in my mind, properly communicating it, and I think, Joey, you've mentioned that. And, are there any last lessons you want to share with our audience as to, what is the best way to develop a communication to the various groups within a higher education organization to make it a palatable process?
Well, I would say that you have to include, a wide variety of stakeholders in the process. Whether you have, a large committee, that has a, very inclusive nature, various stakeholder groups, or if it's a smaller committee and maybe you use focus groups to kind of vet things that are being considered. But decisions in higher education are made through a vetting process. When you go to the university president and you want to make a significant change to something, first question they're going to ask is, who has seen this and what did they have to say? And so going to the faculty senate, going to a benefits committee, going to a staff senate, if these individuals have not heard of any of the information before you get there, there could be issues. But if you've engaged them in the process along the way, then those representatives to those groups are going to be there, maybe even help co-present the information and allow those changes to go through more smoothly. Also, too, I think, floating some of the changes as a proposal, I think helps. Because if people think that you're here and you're just giving them a bunch of information and they have no say-so, then they're not as willing to listen. But I think if you're here to gather information, to gather feedback, and then you can actually go back and incorporate that into your final product, I think people will respect that, and that's kind of how decisions are made in universities.
Yeah, and Joey, I know you said several times that having some of the people, whether it's faculty or anyone else, that the constituency look up to as part of these presentations, even if they're just sitting, up at the podium or next to the person presenting, just gives a different level of comfort to other people that this has been vetted by people they trust.
Well, sure, and that's why I think, to the extent that there are knowledgeable faculty members on campus, I think that it's really important, to include them on the committee and to help them, make the presentation, certainly when it comes to a faculty senate. You've got a wide body of faculty members there from various disciplines. And, here's their knowledgeable faculty member on this topic that is, co-presenting this information, to them. They're not going to be as suspect of somebody's trying to pull one on us, by having their colleague present that information versus just somebody coming from administration and kind of making the rounds to the various committees. So I think that when you include the various stakeholders up front and people understand, what the issues are, why you need to make a change, then I think you're going to have a better outcome.
Sure. And I think one of the, at least my experience, is one of the most common questions that first comes out of the audience when you're making these presentations. What's in it for the university or the college? Why are they doing this? What are they getting out of it? So to your point, having those people in the room or part of the process can comfort a lot of the constituents that it's being done for the right reasons. Eric, any final comment? Sorry, go ahead, Joey.
I was just going to say, I think that it's helpful, to tell people that, all the monies that we're talking about here are employee monies. the institution has already made its contribution to the plan if it's a defined contribution plan each payroll. So when we're talking about managing cost here, we're talking about managing cost of your investments. And I think when people, hear that and understand that, they realize, this is not some administrative move to save money on the budget or something like that, but it really is something that they're doing for us and for our investments. And I think that makes it, it helps engage people a little bit more when they know that it's really their money we're talking about.
Right. Okay, great. Eric, any final comments?
My parting word of wisdom is, in addition to everything that Joey just said, is, focus on this is not about trying to eliminate entirely the risk that, a lawsuit could happen, anything like that, but it is about minimizing your risk and trying not to be the low-hanging fruit, as I think was mentioned earlier. Going through a gap analysis, what we call a gap analysis, and trying to improve your process, see where the holes are and try to stop them up so that, you've got a robust process that will get you the type of plan and program for your participants, for yourselves, that, will really help you save for retirement. That's what this is all about.
Sure. All right, great. Joey, any final thoughts other than that we haven't covered?
No, I think I'm clear.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, everybody. As we noted before, we will be sending out a copy of the webinar's recording to everyone within a few days. And if you haven't done so, you're also welcome to download the presentation slides through the dial-in information that was previously provided. So thanks to Eric and to Joey, and we'll now conclude the webinar.